Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We have a little bit of ground to cover today, so I would rather we start. As I promised you, I'm not a lawyer by profession, but tomorrow I will be Advocate Shadrach, because I will be presenting the closing arguments to persuade, the jury to, sway you one way or the other, based on the evidence that we have dealt with. So today I'm going to finish off discussing the demography of Great Zimbabwe, and then hop on to discussing Khami, so that tomorrow we then present everything and then start to evaluate the different hypotheses based on some of the data that we would have seen. How many people were at Great Zimbabwe? High school quiz. If there is no answer, then we shall not continue. And I have a nice glass of, I wish it was whiskey. How many people were at Great Zimbabwe? 20,000. 500,000. 20,000, 500,000. Well, we are at the auction. Can we have some more? 85. 5,000, 20,000, 500,000. 80? 80,000. 100,000. Okay. The good thing is that I don't know the answer. So I'm learning. Anyway, here we go. Right. The generally accepted estimate for the population of Great Zimbabwe is 20,000 people. And this comes out of Huffman's work, particularly the 3 papers that he did in 1986. So what we are going to be doing today, what we are starting with is, can we decompose this number to understand what does it mean if we unpack this number? If we say Great Zimbabwe had 20,000 people, if we say Great Zimbabwe had 500,000 people, what are the implications of that knowledge? That's what we are going to start with, and then we will then use the evidence to try and see what number we can come up with. So, to give you a little bit of background, Peter Garlick is perhaps, to my knowledge, the first researcher to estimate the total population for Great Zimbabwe, and he argued that Great Zimbabwe had, at its peak, it had a population of between 1,000 to 2,500 adults, and he arrived at this number by assigning, 1 adult per 3 huts, and then it's just a basic computational procedure where he estimated the total number of huts at Great Zimbabwe. So I think he came up with the 800 huts or something like that, or maybe a little bit more than that, and then did some mathematics. Then that figure was challenged by Huffman in 1977, who said that, well, Great Zimbabwe had a population of 11,000 people, with 3 people sharing a hut. What is the size of the huts that we're talking about? So the area of some of those huts, I think the average is round about, let's say, 12 square meters. So that's the size. And can 3 people share that? That is a question for later, but I'm just reporting what Huffman said. But then he escalated the numbers in 1986. He excavated an area that I will show you now, where he said that it was like a high density. So using the language of today, it was like a ghetto. Closely packed houses. So he said, well, the conditions there perhaps suggest that it was 6 people per hut. And then that's how he came up with the... In fact, he said that the population was between 18,000 and 36,000. But 20,000 is the one that stuck. To arrive at this computation, he also took the population distribution curve for what was then Southern Rhodesia, which was done by Kay in 1967, which showed that the population back then, in the 1960s, the majority of that were children, and it was a growing population, which is understandable given that developments in medical care and so on. So that lowered infant mortality significantly. Nevertheless, 20,000, that's the number that we have. But following on from that, we can, economists call this behavior a heading, where, you know, somebody says something and everybody else follows. If I start jumping, then all of you just jump. Why am I jumping? You know, you perhaps don't even ask me, but you just jump. So that's what we did as archaeologists, 20,000 people. Right. What are the implications of that number? Right. If we are to come up with a simple computation like, let's calculate the population density of Great Zimbabwe, we also realize that although Great Zimbabwe is 720 hectares in extent, 30% of that was occupied. So if we multiply that and divide by 20,000, we get a population density of 7,000 people per square kilometer. And, you know, if you have Wi-Fi, you can check, but that was nearly the population density of Hong Kong as of last year. Which figures? So one step. We multiply this 30% of this, right? Of 720 hectares. We can convert that to square kilometers, which comes to 7.2, right? The outcome of that over 20,000 will give you this number. Close. It comes to 6,800 and something. Per square kilometer. So that's also converting, you know, hectares to, so that will come up to 7.2. And then the number that you end up with is 6,800 and something. I don't recall actually. But nevertheless, the implication is that the population density at Great Zimbabwe would have been very high, whatever indicator we use. Even if we say that the whole 720 hectares were occupied, you know, you will get something, the population density in the figure of around 2,000 something, which is perhaps similar to modern day Gaborone. So what are the implications of those numbers? What is the population of modern day Southern Africa? We realize that, you know, Zimbabwe is about 14, South Africa 55, Botswana perhaps just under 2 million. And we also have, you know, Zambia 15. Then the total is around, you know, 116 million. Modern day Nigeria, that's 170 million. And these are the numbers from the World Population Barometer. You can cross-check these on the internet. So the idea is that historically Southern Africa had very low populations. And so if we consider Zimbabwe or the pre-colonial population of these different areas, let's say in the 1900s, in 1890, the estimated population of Zimbabwe or Southern Rhodesia was 700,000. And you know, Botswana was 120,000. The same as perhaps Namibia. So we are talking of very, very low populations. Where am I going with this? If we are to look at the population of Zimbabwe from 1890 to, let's say, 2010, we will get around, you know, nearly 40 million people. what I'm trying to do here is just to demonstrate the fact that historically the population of Southern Africa was very low. And yet, the estimates that we get from the archaeology are perhaps the, Great Zimbabwe 20,000, Halfman 1986, Mapungubwe 5,000, Halfman 1986, Khami, that we will discuss shortly, also had 7,000, K2 1,500, Kadichkwene, which is just, it's a Tswana town here in South Africa. It's about a few kilometers near outside Zeerust in the northwest. Here, the numbers are from the missionary Campbell, who argued back then in 1822, when he went to Kadichkwene, he argued that the population of Kadichkwene at 20,000 was more than that of contemporary Cape Town. So how authentic are these numbers? Can we verify them? I don't know. I'm just presenting to you the numbers from the literature. And then there's also a Tswana town that is known as Molokwane. It is believed that Molokwane had 12,000 people. So these are massive towns. What are the implications of having 20,000 people in one place? Or let alone 5,000 or 1,500 people. These are big numbers. And this is just a map that we perhaps saw earlier, which shows us some of these sites that I mentioned and their population, and also the location of Great Zimbabwe. So, how can we estimate perhaps a more credible population estimate for Great Zimbabwe? What a group of archaeologists, including myself, did was to start with demarcating, coming up with what is the size of Great Zimbabwe? What area was occupied? Because that is also very important. We need to consider the built-up area in terms of coming up with some numbers. So we did some site delimitation, also some geophysical survey to pick up fired house floors on the ground, as well as just a basic ground walking. Then we also considered the ethnography. A typical Shona homestead, how many units does it have, and how many people, how do people share space? And then we did some statistical calculations using some of the databases that are available. For example, Patrick Manning's at Pittsburgh, as well as Frankima and Evans at Geneva. And then whatever the outcome was, what are the sustainability implications for that? So can you have 20,000 people in a certain space, farming, raising cattle, and so on, and with what consequences to the environment? Those are some of the issues. We should also keep in mind that at Great Zimbabwe, no burials have been found to date. The burials that were found mentioned by Richard Hall in 1905, but those relate to the later population, so they date to the late 18th century and so on. But burials relating to actual Great Zimbabwe's peak, not any have been found. So that also limits in terms of, using the burials to contribute to the estimation of pre-colonial demography. So in terms of the ethnography, the Shona houses or homesteads, they tend to have about 5 spaces, place for sleeping, for dining, for cooking, and then for visitors, and so on. So that is also important in terms of demarcating the different homestead units when you have counted the total number of houses at an archaeological site. So how many homesteads can you fit in there? And then we also did our own work, and then the average homestead size was almost 0.4 hectares, and the average hut size being 12.5 square meters. So some demographers argue that on average an individual needs 10 square meters of roofed space. And so we also considered the average household size in Zimbabwe, which was 4 people, and then used that to come up with an estimate. What we also did was to confirm the size of Great Zimbabwe, how big was it. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that the Great Zimbabwe of today, it is an accretion of events that took place over time. So like I said, settlement started here on the hill, and then it expanded to this area here of the Great Enclosure, and then with time the valley enclosures were added, and then later on some of these settlements were added. So in terms of then coming up with the final estimate, one has to also try where possible to have some control over the chronology. Otherwise, the numbers that one get won't make much sense. So in terms of site delimitation, what we simply did was to use some existing data sets, like what Paul Sinclair and others did in terms of delimiting Great Zimbabwe using, identifying the areas that were occupied. I beg your pardon. So this shape here, that is the 720 hectares. And as you can see with these concentrations of the phosphates and so on, these are the areas that were occupied. So when I was talking about that is where the 30% of 720 is coming from. We are excluding this area here because it's not built up. We also did a geophysics survey and then made an attempt, perhaps not so successful, in terms of overlaying the walls on that map. As we can see, again, it's also a small portion if we consider the whole 720 hectares. By the way, the 720 hectares is just an arbitrary boundary that was arrived at, I think, in 1905. Because some of the farmers, like Shepherd this side, this side is Morgenster Mission, Shepherd on this side, and then Mandel on that other side. Here is Morgenster Mission as well. They just said, well, these are the boundaries, and then so on. So it's just an arbitrary. We actually don't know what the full extent of Great Zimbabwe would have been back then. We also tried to carry out some excavations because how deep are the different areas? The depth of deposit is important because it correlates with the duration of occupation, and that information we got from radiocarbon dates and so on. And we also mapped the different areas. So roughly, the deepest area is the hill complex because that's where actually occupation was. Like I said, occupation began on the hill, so that is where most of the occupation took place. And then the other areas, particularly those outside the walls, they are not that deep, so 60 centimeters, that does not compare. And also in terms of the dates, some of the areas outside the walls, they are much later. So how many people, how many houses were in the walled areas? The easiest option was to go into the work that has already been done. Keaton Thompson excavated one area of the valley enclosures, and the average seemed to be, 10 houses per a quarter of a hectare. And then using Huffman's work, where we can say we have 30 houses per a quarter of a hectare. And then just go into GIS and calculate the different areas. So this is the excavation that was done by Keaton Thompson in late 1920s, but published in 1931. So you can count these houses 1, 2, 3, 4, up to about 10, and then also calculate using this scale, calculate the area, which comes up to perhaps close to 1/4 of a hectare. And then using this, then just draw polygons using GIS softwares to say how many of these can you fit in the different areas. And in the Great Enclosure and other areas, we know the number of houses from there. This is the diagram from Tom Huffman's work, where he shows that the houses outside the walls were closely packed. So that's why we are saying, 30 houses per 1/4 of a hectare, again using the scale provided here. Then I mentioned that when we discuss Great Zimbabwe, the issue of chronology is very important. So what we then did was to estimate the extent of the different periods of occupation, and that is what is coming up here, and also the extent of those phases. So the period 1 has been recovered only from the hill, and also period 2 from the hill. So that's why these colors are restricted here. So what we then tried to do was to produce an estimation based on this distribution, rather than an estimate that will try to fit this whole polygon, given that some areas were occupied but others were not. So using this procedure, we came up with a total number of houses that one would get at Great Zimbabwe, walled areas and unwalled areas. So our estimate is at 689 using the procedure that I explained. And then what we then did was just to take some numbers to say, okay, if we say that we have 4 people per hut, how many people can we end up with? If we say that we had 7 people per hut, which is the maximum, how many people can we end up with? So these are the numbers that we ended up with. So 2,756 and almost 5,000. But this is for the entire period from AD 900 to round about 1700 or thereabout. So these figures are quite low, actually, when compared to the estimates of 20,000 and so on. Then we also did another computation where we actually estimated the number of people based on using households. So if we have a household of 4 people, how many? What would be the total outcome? And again, this produced the lowest numbers, 548 and 959. So as you can see, based on these models, the population was rather very, very, very small. So are these numbers realistic? There's need for some moderation, and there's need for some consistent checks. So the first model that I presented would suggest that for 700 years, the minimum population for Great Zimbabwe would have been 2,756, and the maximum would have been 4,823. The numbers are even lower for Model 2 with 548 and 959. So we need some consistency checks to moderate this. So that is when the idea of population-based projection came in. So one of the things that we need to realize is that historically, the population of Southern Africa was very low. And as I said, in 1922, the population of Southern Rhodesia was 800,000. And Great Zimbabwe is situated in a Victoria district, which then had 4.6% of the population. So we just took this number and maybe upscaled it to 5% to allow for permutation of error and so on. And the calculation that we did came up to, in 1600, Victoria district, discounting from 800,000, would have been 200,000, 230,000, using a stable population framework. And if we were to go slower than that, we realized that it would, perhaps by 1400 or so, it would have been perhaps within the region of 100,000. So if we, Great Zimbabwe, Victoria district is around 56,000 square meters. So if we assume that the population was perhaps 5% of that, we come up with at least 15,000 for the whole district. So how many people would have been at Great Zimbabwe? If these numbers are correct, then the suggestion is that that population would also have been very, very small. But let's forget about these numbers that suggest that the population was low for a while, and actually consider, how much land is required for agriculture by 20,000 people? And would that have been sustainable? So 20,000 people, if we assume that a household had 4 people and so on, we can come up with, around over 200 households. And the ethnography suggests that on average, a household of 4 would have almost 7 hectares of land. So if we convert that, we get 1,534 hectares. That excludes grazing lands and so on. So what 20,000 people suggest is that the people at Great Zimbabwe would have needed around 20,000 hectares for them to practice their agriculture sustainably. So again, the implications of the land required for agriculture, it's just unrealistic. But the low populations would perhaps have sustainably occupied that area. And we should also not forget that Great Zimbabwe is in a mountainous area, such that not all land is suitable for farming. And we did some LiDAR scans to just determine, what areas would have been cultivated and so on. So the same applies to grazing lands. Using what the modern, meat farmers, vet scientists, the numbers that they use, we also realize that Great Zimbabwe would have needed a large number or a large amount of land for grazing. So if you add land for grazing as well as land for cultivation, 20,000 people would seem to be a very unsustainable number, unless the people were spread out, by which time we are talking of dispersed urbanism and not concentrated. Because concentrated would mean that the 20,000 people were in one place at a given time. But then if we are talking of a dispersed system, then people are away from the center. Then, of course, maybe the economics would also work. What is the evidence on the ground? No burials have been recovered at Great Zimbabwe. Yes, the stone walling is imposing. However, there are no big dumps. So the assumption here is that if people are living their normal lives, then they would accumulate rubbish. And we would see those big rubbish dumps like the ones we saw from K2. But at Great Zimbabwe, such big dumps are only associated with the stone walls. So we don't see those big dumps. What happened? The density of material culture is also not that big. How about the infrastructure for basic necessities? Where is that infrastructure? If we are talking of 20,000 people, like I said, in terms of resource abundance, the agricultural land, so the subsistence component is very important in these pre-colonial community, such that the subsistence base would normally determine a settlement location. But it is also possible that if there was a small population at Great Zimbabwe, and then the hinterland, the surrounding area, would have played a crucial role in terms of, through trade and exchange, through taxation, resources would have been mobilized, would have been exchanged at different points where demand and supply intersected. So I am leaning here towards a model where the population would have been smaller than at the 20,000 that we think about. So at the beginning, I gave you the population from the different estimates. So Galek said the population was between 1,000 and 2,500. And then Huffman said, well, initially 11,000 and later on 20,000. Our own estimates are suggesting that maybe the population would unlikely have been 2,500. So where do these numbers differ? The our estimates and Galek's are not really that different. The only differentiator is Huffman's use of 1 hut for 6 people, as well as the use of a discount factor from K's population distribution for 1967, which at that point in time, the pre-colonial populations, because of the lack of developments with medical care, the infant mortality rate was very high. So in some cases, maybe 300 people 300 babies would survive out of 1,000, and in some cases it was even worse, such that the population was very low. But what happened with the beginning of colonialism is that there were advances in medical care, which sort of improved, so infant mortality was no longer a problem. So to then consider a population distribution for 1967 is actually inappropriate, because one is comparing apples with oranges. It's not like with like. If it was a population distribution for, let's say, the 1890s, when the advances in medical care had not taken effect, as well as increase in food production and all those other things, then perhaps it would have mattered. So the issue is that perhaps for Great Zimbabwe, we are talking of a very low population, and if we factor in these phases, again the population would be very low. However, the challenge is, how do we estimate the total population for the entire Great Zimbabwe state, which some believe was more than 50,000 square kilometers. Others said it stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Kalahari. How do we estimate? That one is very difficult. We cannot get to that. But because the limitations in the data sets, but perhaps the population would also have been very low. So the idea is that Great Zimbabwe perhaps had a low population, and it is those low populations perhaps that make Great Zimbabwe even more great, because if it was occupied by few people and they built those imposing stone walls, then that's a phenomenal achievement. If you may allow me to take 1 or 2 questions on the population of Great Zimbabwe before hopping over to Khami. Will that work? Or do you want me to go to Khami and then we discuss everything? Okay, questions? Yes.
Surely the population of 2,500, was that consistent over the period of time? Is one question, but if it was 2,500, the number of adults available to build the wall would be surely minimal. The Great Wall around the Great Zimbabwe.
Mm-hmm.
So that took a
Peter Galek did a computation in 1973, and he said that the outer curtain wall of the Great Enclosure would have taken perhaps 40 men around 4 years to build. And one of so 40 men. So in terms of the labor of 40 men for 4 years to build that outer curtain wall of the Great Enclosure. That's I've forgotten the actual specifics, but he suggests that it would have taken 40 men building. But the other thing is that like Rome, Great Zimbabwe was not built in a day. It was also built over time. And more importantly, it doesn't mean that Great Zimbabwe was isolated from the other settlements. The people who were living there perhaps had the capacity to mobilize labor from the rural areas. So the labor would also have come from other areas. So it's not just necessarily a resident population. Otherwise, a key question then that would require explanation is that the infrastructure that we see at Great Zimbabwe, can it sustain 20,000 people all the time? During the flourishing of Great Zimbabwe. Yes, I would be the first to admit that we will never know the exact number of the people that were at Great Zimbabwe. I declare that up front. But all I am saying is that have we considered the implications of 20,000 people in one place for 250 years? Does that work? That is just what I'm saying. We can differ in terms of, how many do you come up with 5,000 people? Do you come up with 500 and then so on? But the key question is that if we are to dip into sustainability science, are 20,000 people in 720 hectares, is that sustainable? If it is sustainable, that's fine. But where is the infrastructure to support that? In Hong Kong we have those double stories and so on and so on. Where are they at Great Zimbabwe?
Sorry, I'm having a lot of problems with the whole of the way this is being conceptualized. I'm not sure if I can put it all summarize. But what evidence is there, for instance, that a substantial population was resident at Great Zimbabwe for any length of time at all? Could it not have been a site where perhaps there was a core of residents, but people moved in and out? I'm thinking of, say, and this is not my area, but something like the Baryon population in Mapela.
Mm-hmm.
There is a central area, but the people farm well beyond that and move in and out of that area over a period of time. Or to give a very different kind of an example, a lot of South African towns have got these things they call knock-on nations. The work farmers, the kind of farmers, used to come into a local town every 3 months for the 3-monthly communion service. And if they were wealthy enough, they had a little kind of house where they could stay. But they only occupied that for a week or 10 days every 3 months. Surely when one's talking about a place like this, one shouldn't think in terms of an urban population in that we think of modern industrial urban cities. Is it not perhaps as a situation where people are, it's being sustained by a much larger population living over a much larger area who occasionally come in for ritual episodes or seasonal celebrations or things like that?
I wouldn't disagree with you. I completely agree with you. That's why, was it yesterday or the day before, when I was talking about the models that David Beach and others are coming up with, where they are interpreting the different stone-walled components as individual homesteads. Then what you are talking about, the model of a diaphragm, which breathes in and out. and where the settlement can expand and shrink depending on the activities and so on. One would have to develop some interesting mathematical calculations in terms of modeling that flow that you are talking about. So 3 months and modeling that flow. But certainly, I think if I'm getting you correctly, what you are suggesting is that it is possible for Great Zimbabwe to have been as great as it is with a small population, if we factor in all these other things. The problem with the written word is, if something is written, it doesn't matter whether it makes sense or not, but it's there. You are stuck with it, and actually, you need to do much more, than the person that I can just give you a thumbsuck figure. If I'm the first person to study Great Zimbabwe, I can give you a thumbsuck figure and say there were 20,000 people, right? He will then write his paper. He quotes me 20,000 people. If you want to actually challenge that number, you won't. It's just the nature of how sometimes we construct knowledge, but nevertheless, that's why we are actually putting out this new type of thinking to get feedback from others, like that valuable contribution that you have provided. So hopefully, when we are teaching in schools, when we are doing these and other things, then we can. What I'm saying here is that we must think more critically. We must reflect on some of these numbers. What is the implication of this knowledge? Yes, Shadrach is telling us this, but what does he mean? Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
That hypothesis you just mentioned with the opinion of Peter Garlick, he thought that Great Zimbabwe was a centralized area for a very large grazing area. What worries me about Garlick's hypothesis is that people like Beach say that in 1200 AD, Zimbabwe had very few cattle. I don't understand how there can be 20,000 head of cattle in the Muslinga area.
So, what he is talking about is what Peter Garlick published in 1978. It's a paper published in the Journal of African History called Pastoralism in Zimbabwe. He is talking about what he calls a livestock transhumance hypothesis, where ecologically Great Zimbabwe is situated on the margin of the sour veldt and the sweet veldt. So the sour veldt nutritious during the summer, but in the winter, the grasses are there, they lose their nutritional value, which is the opposite of the sweet veldt. So what Garlick is saying is that the residents of Great Zimbabwe migrated their cattle in between to take advantage of the nutritional value of the sour veldt and the sweet veldt. If we think of AD 1200 and low populations, would there have been any pressure for land? Let's not forget that the land tenure system that we currently have changed in 1890. So, so that is one of the things that we should also think about. But also, let's not forget the feedback processes between history and archaeology, whereby David Beach is a historian. He is reading Garlick and Huffman, right? He's very good friends with Huffman up to a point. And then what then happens is that Garlick says, well, this is the version because the historians are saying that. So I read Beach. Just like now, you say, well, Great Zimbabwe had 20,000 people because Shadrach said it, Then I turn around and I said, yeah, Great Zimbabwe had 20,000 people because you also said it. So how do we disentangle the feedback between, and the time that Beach was writing, particularly that 1980 book and so on, archaeological research was not yet well developed, such that the number of archaeological sites the number of known archaeological sites was very small. The number of people working on the ground was also very small, which meant that the sample size that they were dealing with was also very small, and which also limited the conclusions, which is why I was saying that, look, the number of observations has now increased. Should we be stuck with those models that were developed in the 1970s, when it was only Halfman in South Africa, or perhaps Mason? South Africa had many people. In southern Rhodesia, it was probably 3 or so people. In Zambia, maybe 2, and so on. Should we be stuck with those models? I don't know. All I am saying is that let's critically engage with whatever knowledge we have. What are the implications of that knowledge? I wasn't there. I wouldn't tell you what happened, but I can tell you what I think would have happened.
You got trained as an architect. You did an architect's degree at Cape Town University.
And ended up at University College London. And so that's but nevertheless he was a very fine researcher. So sorry to break the party, but a little bit about Khami.
Sorry. They estimate there are 2 million stones.
2.5 million.
2.5 million stones.
The outer curtain wall of. Yes, of that great enclosure.
They built that in 4 years.
Yes, including 4 men. What we could do is that
How many men?
40.
40 men.
Yeah, and let's to simplify this. Tomorrow, let me go and bring the actual figures from Galec. Or continue with your question. Sorry.
Because that means they were laying stones faster than a good bricklayer would lay bricks. A good bricklayer doesn't have to go and find the stone somewhere else and put it to size. And a good bricklayer doesn't have to fill in the inside. You said the inside was filled up with other stuff.
With the core, yes, with the rubble of core. So just 1 sec. Here we go. This is how So Great Zimbabwe is like this. You have this outer face, and then you have this inner core. That is how the walls are constructed, like this one. So the thing is that because Galec was an architect, one would also assume that perhaps his estimates were informed by intuition from engineering. So you are demonstrating knowledge from the engineering and then construction field. But not many of us archaeologists are from that world, And this behavior, like I said, the behavior of heading, because it's written by Galec. So what can stop me from also citing it, But it's a very interesting statistic that you provide, that an ordinary in terms of bricklaying, one would actually need more time. So that's if I may, I have to admit that we need perhaps more credible and more robust estimates in terms of what are the labor requirements that were needed. But also, while we are still on that, the walls collapse. Some of these walls collapse. And then at Great Zimbabwe, there is this team of stone masons that repair them. So maybe so it takes them 3 weeks or so. They repair a good size of a wall, but mostly because the stones are there, they're just picking them and and placing them one on top of the other. So maybe that could be the starting point in terms of of making the calculations. But of course, I take the point that it is even more important to consider the amount of labor that is required from quarrying, transporting that, and so on, to build that into the total amount of time required. Wow, this is very important. Today I've learned so much. Thank you. Do we have more questions? You want Khami? No, it's just the same. I won't shortchange you. What I will simply then do is that tomorrow I will just be very fast, but I will still present my closing arguments. I will still present Khami. I won't shortchange you, I promise. Yes, sir.
A widespread rural practice is that the dead are buried maybe 10 or 20 meters away from the homestead. What could cause the absence of burials in Great Zimbabwe? Is it that the soil chemistry dissolved the bones completely, or
a lighter answer to that, I'm just joking, and I must declare that I'm joking. The lighter answer would be that the people in Great Zimbabwe, maybe they didn't die. Otherwise, we would have found them. But yes, on a more serious note, you are right that the soil is very acidic. But how do we explain the fact that burials were recovered from similar sites? I mentioned that K2, which is actually earlier than Great Zimbabwe, had more than 70 burials. Mapungubwe Hill, which is also older than what we are talking about here, also had these burials. So perhaps I would like to believe that the archaeologists haven't yet recovered where the people were buried. But some of these excavations, particularly by Richard Hall, they were quite extensive, which is one of those enigmas, if we may use that word. So maybe that's one good reason to hang around Great Zimbabwe. Maybe one day we might be able to find the burials, which is the holy grail of the archaeologists. So where does Khami fit into the picture? That is one of the biggest questions. Traditionally, it used to be argued that Great Zimbabwe collapsed at AD 1450, while some people migrated northwards to establish the Mutapa state. Others went to the southeast and established Khami. So Khami is just outside Bulawayo, and this is the location of Khami. So Great Zimbabwe, we are here. It's about maybe 322 kilometers between the two. But what is also interesting is that Khami is this is an image of Khami, of the hill complex at Khami from the air. And Khami, unlike Great Zimbabwe, is comprised of these platforms, and houses were built on top. So this is the western side of the hill complex. I must also state that Khami is a World Heritage Site, like Great Zimbabwe. This is a reconstruction. It was done in probably from 2002 onwards. So this is not original. This is a reconstruction. Let's get that clear. This is a reconstruction which was done in 2003, but nevertheless, Khami is a World Heritage Site, and the architecture there is mostly platforms. So, like I said, the thinking in the old days was that the people from Great Zimbabwe established Khami, and that is the location of Khami. But what is also interesting is that we have seen this map earlier on, is that according to a paper published by Peter Garlick in 1970, you can actually come up with a typology of walls. There is one side where you have freestanding walls, so that's Great Zimbabwe type, and you also have one side where you have platforms that are similar to Khami. So the other day I was saying that Mapungubwe and Mapela, they share so much with Khami, particularly as far as platforms are concerned. My reasoning was influenced by this map from Peter Galek. So what traditional models tell us is that from constructing freestanding walls, the people that are alleged to have left Great Zimbabwe, when they went to Khami for one reason or another, largely unknown, they decided to build platforms. What makes this dubious is that in the area around Khami, the Leopardoscopy people were already resident there, and they were building those platforms. So why would they need people from Great Zimbabwe to teach them what they were already doing? I don't have an answer to that, but this is the implication of the knowledge that we have. Khami flourishes from 1450 to 1650, and that is after the collapse of Great Zimbabwe. This is just a map to orient us in terms of the location of Khami vis-a-vis Great Zimbabwe, and this is the estimated size of the Khami state, which was quite extensive. One of the most interesting things about Khami is that it overlaps with the Portuguese period, and a number of Portuguese chroniclers, they make some statements about Khami. And one of the things that frustrated the Portuguese the most was that the inhabitants or the rulers of Khami were not interested in gold trade at all. Rather, they were interested in cattle keeping. So that's something that comes out of some of the Portuguese record. But nevertheless, the territory in which Khami is located is also quite good for cattle production. It's also good for gold production. But according to the Portuguese, these people were not interested in trading gold at all. And one of the reasons why Khami collapsed was actually the influence of the Portuguese, and this is a site map of Khami, which shows that the site is distributed along Khami River, and it is comprised of different platforms that have these numbers. The biggest platform is the hill complex, which is here. One interesting thing that links Khami to the Portuguese is this ruin here, which is known as the platform, rather, which is known as the cross ruin. It's known as the cross ruin because there is a cross. I hope tomorrow I'll be able to find the photograph. But just like the Christian cross, which is built of rocks, and legend has it that it was built by the Portuguese in 1650 when they destroyed the site. How do we know? How do we verify that? I don't know, but that is where the name of the cross ruin is coming from. There is a cross. If you go there, you will see that cross. So there is a lot of debate and controversy. Is it a Portuguese cross, or is it just something's creative imagination? I don't know, but at least Khami features significantly in Portuguese imagination. I mentioned that archaeological site, Leopardoscopy, a lot. This is where it is located. So just across the river from these main platforms at Khami. And that is the very first archaeological site where this was recovered. And there are so many similar Leopardoscopy sites. So this is just a photograph showing you how the site of Leopardoscopy looks like. It's a very small copy, and the Kalanga version of that could be the heel of the leopard. So that's why it's known as the Leopardoscopy. Khami has, I'm wrapping up now, I'll just show you the key features, and then for interpretation, we'll have to deal with that tomorrow. So, like I said, the hill complex at Khami, at the western side, this is a reconstruction. This is what is known as the precipice ruin, which is next to the dam. Again, the other side of the same wall. This is what is known as the Flay ruin. So if we are talking in terms of the architecture, nicely cut blocks, one on top of the other, you can also see the coursing. So one of the reasons why people tended to think that Khami came out of Great Zimbabwe is that in terms of Anthony Whitty's architectural classification at Great Zimbabwe, this Q style or high quality style comes much later. So the thinking then is that when you see this style, it must also be later. But I will show dating evidence to suggest that, well, some of it is actually earlier. And you can also see some of these designs, which are the different colors of rocks, creating different patterns. So that is what is known as the passage platform. So just to emphasize the differences in terms of the construction. So you could have, the platform would go this way, and then you have an outer face, and then a core. And that is the difference with the freestanding walls where you have outer face. But basically, it's a variation in the same theme. So there is also evidence that these platforms were extended over time. As we can see from this diagram, this was the beginning, and then it was also extended. And sometimes you can see as many extensions possible as people expanded to create settlements. So these are some of the radiocarbon dates from Khami, which basically are in the region of the 16th century. Here I'm going into interpretation and so on. So let me rather end here, and we'll start from discussing the archaeological finds and the dates from Khami, as well as presenting the final arguments, which means that tomorrow I will have to speak a little bit faster than usual. But if there are no questions about Khami, thank you.